Hey Bethlehem, this is Pastor Paul, and you know that we've been in this sermon series called Living in Grace as we look at the book of Galatians. Galatians is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a series of churches in the province of Galatia, churches that he started. And one of the unique things about these churches is that they were made up primarily of people who were Gentiles or people who were not Jewish. They didn't have the background of Old Testament law that the Jews had. They didn't know. They weren't part of quote unquote God's chosen people. And Paul is bringing to them the gospel. Now, the gospel is not just the good news of personal salvation that we can be saved from our sins. No, the gospel is the announcement that God's kingdom is breaking into this world through the person of Jesus Christ. Because of his life, his death, his resurrection, God's kingdom is coming into this world. And part of what God's kingdom is a people who are made up of every nation of the world. And nation, remember, is not just these countries that we seem to, as we look at it today. No, nation is about family groups and language groups. And Paul has started these churches, and he said, you can come and be part of God's family, God's universal family, simply by faith in Jesus. And then this group called the Judaizers have come in behind or after Paul and said, no, that's not true. In order to be part of God's family, part of God's people, you have to follow the law. You have to be circumcised. You have to observe Sabbaths, and you have to observe the food laws. You have to do these things in order to be part of God's people. And Paul heard this, and he writes to them and saying, no, this isn't true. And Paul is making a case that God's family is made up of not of people who follow the law, but people who live by faith. And so Paul talks about this, and he uses three realities to get this across. As we looked at our sermon text from last week, Galatians chapter 3, verses 15 through 25. And first he says that the promise or the covenant that God made with Abraham to bless all the nations of the world is superior to the covenant that God makes with Abraham that gives the law. That the promise is greater than the law. The promise to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham's descendant is greater than the law that was given to Israel to separate them out of the world. And Paul goes on to say that the purpose of the law was to reveal sin, to reveal that we can't live up to God's expectations, that we don't have that within our power, that we need help, we need salvation. And then he says the third reality is that the law made the way of Jesus possible. That one of the purposes of the law was then to allow Israel to prepare the way of the Messiah, to prepare the way of the blessing God was giving. So to make way for the promise of God. So Paul is saying this has been true from the very beginning. Abraham was declared righteous not because he followed the law, but because he lived by faith. You are the true descendants of Abraham, not because you follow the law, but because you follow his example of living by faith in the Messiah. So the big idea from this past week is that the law was given to prepare the way for Jesus. The law was given to prepare the way for Jesus. That was the purpose of the law. It was to prepare Israel so that the Messiah could come. And when the Messiah came, he will bless all the nations of the world. So our challenge here is that we need to live by God's wisdom. And the place that we should start when we talk about living with God's wisdom is the Sermon on the Mount. So this week I encourage you at least one time to read through the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, and ask God to reveal his wisdom to you. How can you apply this or live this out in your life? Hey, thank you, Bethlehem, for being part of our Christian community. Remember this coming Sunday, which is July 4th, the day that we celebrate Independence Day. We are going to have our worship at 9 o'clock in the morning rather than 10:30. So come at 9, worship, and then following worship, you will still be able to participate in the other festivities of the day. So hope you can make it on Sunday at 9 o'clock. Have a wonderful week. Take some time off, take some rest, realign your heart, your mind with God, and we'll see you later. God bless.